As she said, North Korea presents the world's greatest risk of nuclear war. That's frightening enough, but what's even more terrifying is the general ignorance about North Korea. As a country, we've often stumbled into wars in places we didn't know very much about. The original Korean War in 1950, the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, and when you do stumble into war and don't know much about it, typical result is a mess. On May 8th of last year, Secretary of State Pompeo, who had previously served as director of the CIA, referred to the leader of North Korea as Chairman Un. He hadn't yet figured out which was the family name and which was the middle name. What if a Korean leader referred to Donald John Trump as President John? What would we think? In that situation, 3 research centers here at Harvard decided it was imperative to publish a book that would inform and dispel myths and reflect all the major issues and all the conflicting points of view. This book includes chapters that support the current negotiations and chapters that hate the current negotiations. It has chapters by very senior American leaders and by China's former top intelligence officer looking at North Korea. It includes several chapters that will explain very clearly why everything I'm about to tell you is nonsense. While I worked very hard at including all points of view, in the course of doing this, I developed some pretty strong opinions. Those of you who know me know that I invariably develop strong opinions. My basic conclusion is that the North Korean nuclear crisis can possibly be resolved if we pursue a strategy of peace rather than a strategy of pure bludgeoning through sanctions. But success will require abandonment of an awful lot of our conventional wisdom. The risks of failure are greater than the chances of success. But when you're dealing with nuclear war, you have to take every chance you have, and you have to throw yourself into the effort with everything you've got. Most of the time we have pursued a strategy of forced denuclearization by bludgeoning North Korea with sanctions, a lot of the time hoping that the regime will collapse. That approach has had no success, and it has no chance of success. The North Koreans are unbelievably tough. Korea fought China for centuries and won. They can take an awful beating. But a strategy of denuclearization as a byproduct of achieving peace on the peninsula does have some chance of success. Again, I don't want to overhype it, but if there's a chance, we need to take it. Absent a broader peace, North Korea would be giving up its only real defense if it gave up nuclear weapons. It's not going to do that. Nuclear weapons serve multiple purposes for North Korea. When Kim Jong-un was trying to establish himself as the leader, the nuclear explosions were a vital source of prestige and stature in consolidating his position. Their experience up until the nuclear explosions was nobody paid any attention to what they said. Now people pay attention to what they say. That's the second key purpose. And the third key purpose, of course, is defending and deterring any kind of attack. Now, the first two purposes have been solved. They don't need them for that anymore. What they do need them for is defense. But the nuclear weapons interfere with what I will describe as his absolute imperative for economic development. So a strategy of denuclearization has to involve giving him a path to economic development, taking away the sanctions, and making the nuclear weapons less necessary. This is what I worked on with South Korea at the beginning of my career back in the 70s. South Korea was developing nuclear weapons very fast, and we stopped them. I will say more about that later. Diplomacy with North Korea is bedeviled by all sorts of myths. Perhaps the most important myth is a kind of unarticulated image of North Korea as this giant tiger that's aggressively trying to take over the South. In fact, it's a tiny mouse. It has half the population of South Korea. Its economy is 2% of the South Korean economy, 2%. I was at a conference recently where a Korea scholar had looked up and found that the North Korean economy is the same size as Dayton, Ohio. North Korea has no friends. China doesn't want it to collapse, but China is feared and hated. And on the Chinese side, they despise North Korea. North Korea's people mostly lack electricity and heat and worry about whether they'll be able to feed their kids. As a tiny mouse backed into a corner, all it can do is bite. And when it bites, it hurts. It angers us and the South Koreans. But the bites don't turn a mouse into a tiger. Nuclear weapons don't change that. About half an hour after any North Korean use of nuclear weapons, the country would disappear from the map and its leaders would die. Because they know this, we know this, the South Koreans know it, nuclear threats by Pyongyang are useless. A central lesson of Cold War strategic studies was that in a nuclear world, nuclear weapons are only useful for defense. Unfortunately, right up to last year, senior people in Washington were spinning theories of how North Korea planned to use nuclear weapons to take over the South. Doesn't work. mice don't swallow elephants. Another problem with a lot of contemporary thought about North Korea is that the commentary says, well, North Korea has always played us, so of course they're just playing us again. They certainly have played us many times over the years, and viciously. But a lot of this commentary reminds me of the children's story about the flock of ducks that always flew backwards because it wanted to see where it had been, not where it was going. Now we have a new North Korean leader with a Swiss education, with some knowledge of economics beyond the Stalinoid teaching that his father and grandfather were exposed to. And he has a time horizon that's very different from his father's. He needs to hang around and keep his job for maybe 40 years. The only way he can possibly do that is to clean up the mess his father left and fix the economy. And he knows that. He's actually taken extraordinary risks in jettisoning the old military first priority, where the military basically got everything. And he's trying to shift the balance back toward economic development. Remember, this is what happened in South Korea, and General Park Chung-hee took over and reduced the focus on the military and said, we're going to bet everything on economic development. Up to that time, North Korea had a bigger economy, more powerful military, and it was politically more stable. But that shift to economic priorities led to today's situation where South Korea is 50 times the North Korean economy. He's also, in doing that, he's taken a horrible risk, because the establishment in North Korea totally indoctrinated with this military first priority. And so he's had to shoot a few people and fire a lot of people and to risk his job in starting to make this shift. He's also put himself at risk in another shift. He's opened up the North Korean economy from a very low base, just a little bit, but to the point where everybody in North Korea has a pretty good idea how bad their situation is compared with everybody else in the world. And that creates a finite time, a finite deadline for Kim Jong-un's and the regime's survival. They got to start fixing the economy, or that knowledge, that bursting of the bubble where they, for 2 generations, they told people, oh, we're really well off and the South Koreans are terribly impoverished. That bubble is gone. They made this shift of priorities officially in April of 2017. And the New Year's speech following that shift, Kim Jong-un actually apologized to his people for not having made the kind of progress they hoped for. For his father and his grandfather, apologizing to the people for lack of economic progress was absolutely unimaginable. So this is a real change. On top of that, the international context is quite new. Because of the nuclear tests, China and the United States have stopped playing this game of it's your problem, no, it's your problem, no, it's your problem. Both of them are very focused on the need to act, to do something. And South Korea has a competent, liberal, peace-minded administration. In the past, they've had tough, conservative administrations that criticized any kind of opening to the North, and they've, in one case, had an incompetent liberal administration. Now they've got a competent government with a lot of very strong public support for the peace effort. So a new, mostly auspicious situation. But the two sides in this case being the U.S. and North Korea, distrust each other for very good reasons. Past North Korean behavior, headlined in our press, has been deceptive, unreliable, and often vicious. So the U.S., understandably, has been saying, you denuclearize first, and then we'll lift the sanctions. North Koreans have a slightly different perspective, and the reasons are somewhat less well known in this country. The U.S. has consistently failed to deliver on its promises to both North Korea and South Korea. This was most notable in the aftermath of the 1994 Framework Agreement, where the North Koreans said, we will allow you to put inspectors in our major nuclear plant. And at that time, it was the only place that could produce bomb material. And in return, we said, we will provide you with fuel, with a monitored light water reactor for power, with consular arrangements, and with cultural exchanges. Have any of you read anywhere about our fulfilling those promises? We didn't do any of it. How did that happen? Well, the complications and arguments could fill a whole nother book. But let me provide you with a vignette. When John Bolton became Undersecretary of State for President George W. Bush, he told his colleagues that his number one priority was to kill the Framework Agreement. At one point, Secretary of State Colin Powell was in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York trying to finalize a deal with a North Korean counterpart. Next door was a room assigned by and another room assigned by the president was a group that was supposed to support Colin Powell. One of the people in that group was John Bolton, who spent the entire time on the phone with Dick Cheney trying to come up with new conditions the U.S. could add to make an agreement impossible.
Which year was this?
They succeeded. This was early in the Bush administration. The Framework Agreement formally ended when we confirmed that North Korea had a highly enriched uranium facility in addition to its plutonium production operation. Was that facility an example of Pyongyang's perfidy? Was it an attempt to hedge against the fact that the U.S. wasn't delivering and they didn't trust us to deliver? You can answer according to your own preconceptions. Was it wise for us to respond with a temper tantrum and jerk our inspectors out of their nuclear plant? Well, a lot of the people who were at high levels involved in this for the U.S. government think that's one of the dumbest things we ever did. We had inspectors inside their plutonium operation, and we pulled them out. I quote one of the guys, a special forces officer, Denny Lane, who was one of the inspectors in the book, rather colorful language about what he thinks. So in addition to not delivering on our framework promises, we created a frightening precedent in Libya, one that the North Koreans talk about all the time. We got the Libyans to give up their nuclear program, and then we just exulted as Gaddafi was dragged to his death. We spent the Bush administration openly betting on North Korean collapse. We abandoned our nuclear agreement with Iran. What does that say to the North Koreans? So North Korea says, we'll give up our nukes after you make peace. So if either side sticks to its quite understandable initial position, no agreement, no peace, no denuclearization is possible. However reasonable those initial positions seem to hardliners at home in either country. Under these conditions, our policy slogan, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, was never achievable in any short time. Any successful denuclearization has to be done in stages over a considerable period of time in ways that build mutual confidence. There is no conceivable denuclearization outside of a peace deal. As long as the nuclear weapons are this tiny mouse's only defense, the mouse isn't going to give up its defense. The U.S. has been quite ambivalent about a peace agreement because it fears that U.S. troops might be forced out of South Korea. A formal peace agreement would mean dismantling the United Nations Command, which is the umbrella under which our troops stay there. Now that you could come up with a new deal, but it's complicated. That price might be worth paying. War in Korea happens repeatedly. It's kind of right in the middle of everything, Japan, Russia, China, and our power. But the price is not inevitable. North Korea has three enemies, aside from South Korea: China, Japan, and the United States. And right now their focus is on us. If there's a peace with us, their focus is on China. And they might well want American troops in Korea to balance China. Incidentally, one North Korean negotiator suggested that the U.S. might be making a terrible mistake in demanding denuclearization. He said that after a U.S.-North Korea peace agreement, the nukes would be pointed at China, and that might be helpful to the United States. Having said that, China and Russia are absolutely essential partners in any peace negotiation. Notwithstanding China's determination to make sure that North Korea doesn't collapse, Chinese and U.S. interests in denuclearization pretty much overlap. The Chinese are very conscious that Beijing and Shanghai are potential targets of those weapons. The main nuclear facility is right on the Chinese border, and the kids around that area are coming out with no arms, no legs, no genitals, because the safety conditions are not ideal. And the Chinese are very afraid that that could slop over to the Chinese side of the border, right? Particularly if there's some kind of accident. Incidentally, the China chapter of this book is particularly authoritative. It's by a professor who, for 19 years before he became a professor, was the Chinese Army General Staff's expert on signals intelligence regarding North Korea. So he was listening to their phones. China can help us forge a deal. Moreover, because U.S. promises have no value, any peace agreement is going to have to be guaranteed by the Chinese and Russians. And so it's imperative that China be fully engaged. This is one thing the Trump administration has dropped the ball on. U.S. Expresses considerable disdain for China's determination to avoid a destabilized North Korea. But it's just possible that the Chinese have that one right. We think about getting rid of these bad regimes, as we did in Iraq, but we tend not to think about what comes next. And what comes next could be a broad war, it could be a nuclear war, and it could involve North Korea's becoming a province of China. That's what the Chinese think the outcome would be. So, we've got a chance. It's a difficult chance. The problem is time is short. Time is very short. Notwithstanding some auspicious developments, Kim Jong-un's under a lot of pressure. He could lose his job or his life if he doesn't deliver something relatively soon. His opponents want to return to the old ways of confrontation and military aggressiveness. That would not be a good outcome for the U.S. The Trump and the Kim administrations are in a funny way parallel in that both of their establishments are determined that the negotiations will not succeed. Both leaders have made serious missteps in the way they present their positions and in the process. And that enables attacks by the old guard on both sides. President Moon in South Korea and President Trump may not be in power a lot longer. And this has become a very personal mission for both of them. So early, incremental but decisive progress is really our only hope. Anyone who's optimistic about early peace, and I certainly am not, needs further study and reflection. Trump and Kim are both pretty volatile personalities. Both have backward-looking establishments that hope their leaders will fail. But any leader who doesn't grasp every possible opportunity to avoid a risk of nuclear war just isn't responsible. Let me draw some perspective from 2 episodes. Earlier I mentioned South Korea. In the early 1970s, South Korea was economically, militarily, and politically inferior to the North. They decided their only hope was nuclear weapons, and they made extraordinarily rapid progress. My first book, Asia's Nuclear Future, evolved out of the effort to stop the nuclear programs in Taiwan and South Korea in particular. We stopped the South Korean nuclear program with very tough threatened sanctions on the part of Richard Nixon. Nixon was a decisive guy. He said, you go ahead with the nuclear weapons, we take away all our diplomatic support, all our military alliance, and all our economic assistance. So all you'll have is nuclear weapons. And that stopped the program for a while in both Taiwan and South Korea. Taiwan tried again in the early 80s. South Korea didn't. And the reason South Korea didn't, we kept talking to them, saying, you know, a nuclear exchange on the Korean Peninsula means the end of Korean civilization. Koreans are the most nationalistic people on the earth. And that was simply unthinkable for them. So when they thought about it, no, we just don't want to go that route. Now the North Koreans are in the position that South Korea was in 1970. Maybe we could lead them toward the same conclusion. This book concludes with a chapter by Kathy Stevens. Kathy started in Korea in the Peace Corps and worked her way up to being our first Korean speaking ambassador. She's acting Under Secretary of State. She was also chargé d'affaires in Northern Ireland when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And her chapter says, you know, in Northern Ireland, peace was achieved through this incredible determination to keep going in the right direction in the face of implacable hatred, murder after murder after murder, terrorism. You remember the bombs going off in the city of London. Similar determination to proceed despite mutual demonization, mutual deception, violent history, and a lot of setbacks is the only possible way forward with North Korea. Now you bring Donald Trump into this equation. He's tackled the problem with the priority it deserved. Obama told him, this is your number one problem. And he's taken it seriously. By the way, I'm a fan of Obama. Obama kind of dropped the ball on this one. Trump understands that this is a CEO level deal. If we send a retired assistant secretary to deal with the big boss, that is a terrible insult, especially in Confucian culture. He knows that if we refuse to negotiate with bad guys, there's an awful lot of the world we won't be able to negotiate with. Having said that, his expression, I love Kim Jong-un, has to be the creepiest sentiment in modern international relations. His abandonment of the Iran deal undermines the credibility of any deal with North Korea. The U.S. establishment's disdain for his whole negotiation undermines the credibility. Trump always fails to do proper preparation. Oh yeah, let's get together, let's have a summit. But he has a superb negotiator in Steve Biegun. This is one of the very best that America has. He had the good sense to fire John Bolton. Anybody who fires John Bolton has some good qualities. Trump's approach makes a lot more sense than the establishment's backward-looking view, but he has disdained the imperatives of collaborating with China and Russia. On balance, because time is running out, Trump's disjointed, cringe-inducing diplomacy is the best shot we have to avert the world's greatest risk of nuclear war. As one Korean professor said when I interviewed him for this book, if Donald Trump is reelected, it's a tragedy for the United States. If he's not reelected, it's a tragedy for Korea. That's the kind of complexity we're dealing with here.